Uncle Sam came knocking on the Reagans' front door.
And I was drafted with the first married men. The first married men that left Gastonia. I was with that bunch. I had already had Becky, our oldest daughter, and Joyce was on the way when I was drafted. And that was in May 1943.
What was going through your mind when you found out that you were going to be going? And
well, it really didn't surprise me because just about all the men were going then, you know, that were young. Mm-hmm. And so it really didn't surprise me at all.
On May 13, 1943, Earl was inducted into the United States Army at Camp Croft, South Carolina, and was first assigned to Fort McClellan, Alabama, for 17 weeks of basic training that was meant to turn raw young recruits into battle-ready warriors.
I had been, you know, working in the mill, and I was used to work, and I kind of tough, I guess, so I got tired, but I didn't drop out.
While at Fort McClellan, the soldiers received a visit from an officer who had just returned from the front lines to give them a so-called pep talk.
He made the statement, and now how true it is, that the life of a rifleman in an infantry platoon, and that's what I was, a rifleman, that his lifespan is less than a minute. I mean, it was seconds in actual combat, you know, when forces are firing at one another and shells coming over and all that stuff going on. And that didn't boost our morale.
Yeah, I wouldn't think so. I wouldn't think so.
I said, that guy could have stayed in Japan, you know.
Yeah.
After his basic training, he returned home for a 5-day delay en route before his overseas assignment, only to find out that the birth of his second child was just days away.
Just in a few days, the feelings emotionally was from one spectrum to another. When I knew I was going to get to come home to see them, of course, I was elated.
The day he came in, I went to the hospital that night, and then she was born up in the morning, and then it must have been the day after is probably when he left.
Then when Joyce was born, and I was still elated, but knowing I had to leave her, it was like the bottom dropping out. Here, you know, a wife and 2 children, you're going to be gone for 2 years. So it wasn't a happy time at that, you know, when I had to leave.
Sort of like a death, really. And but I know he kept walking around and he wouldn't talk. Had nothing to say to anybody. And so finally I told him, I said, well, if you have to go, go. I can't take it any longer.
Well, I didn't know how long I was going to be gone, to duration, though. I mean, I knew I'd be there till the war was over.
Before shipping out to Europe, he spent 5 days at Fort George Meade, Maryland. He then went on to his point of departure, a little place in upstate New Jersey called Camp Shanks.
Boy, you talk about a place.
Not a place you want to give back.
No, man. For instance, they had eating eggs in there one morning. They had some boiled eggs, and this one guy broke his egg, and a biddy was still in it. So, and there was so much smoke in there, you know, you had to feel your way to the table to find it and all, but it was something else. But it was a kind of like a POE area, port of embarkation. You went from there to the boat, then you were gone.
Earl was assigned to serve in General George Patton's 3rd Army in Northern Ireland, but first he had to get there.
I went, believe it or not, over on the Queen Elizabeth, one of the biggest boats or ships, and went from there to Glasgow, Scotland, and boarded some trucks and went to Birmingham, England, and spent 2 or 3 nights there, and snowed while we was there. Then we went over to, must have been Wales or Scotland somewhere else, and caught an old boat at night, and that thing was creaking, and it must have been one of the worst boats they ever had. But we anyway went from there to Northern Ireland.
In Northern Ireland, the troops received a personal visit from Generals George Patton and Dwight D. Eisenhower.
That's where I joined the 5th Infantry Division, you know, that I was with. In Northern Ireland, it's one of the most beautiful places in the world, I think. If you wanted to go for, you know, a tour or vacation or something like that, but it's anytime you're taking training, you know, it was just the extended training that we had there with that division. But you got beautiful, beautiful mountains there, and you look down off of those mountains when you're up there on maneuvers, and they're called the Mourne Mountains, M-O-U-R-N, and boy, it is Mourne too. And it's right on the Irish Sea, cold, and the wind blowing off that sea, and we'd go up those mountains. You'd think you'd see the top of it. When you get up there, level off, and there was another one. And you didn't have any big trees to knock off the wind like you did here. Those old heather bushes or something like that, you know, you'd try to get behind them. But the training was You know, it was tough, but I met a lot of boys there in the same boat I was in, so, you know, we all went through the same thing.
The training Earl received at Fort McClellan, Alabama was nothing compared to the exercises he was about to face.
In fact, I remember one of our training that we had to go through was we had to walk 90 miles in 3 days, if you can believe that. 30 miles a day. And from time to, you know, you could get up until dark and you felt like dropping then. A lot of guys did drop.
The obstacles were physically and psychologically exhausting.
Of course, you had to go through all kind of infiltration courses, you know, with live ammunition shooting over your head, and you was crawling through all the barbed wire and all that. Just like any infantry soldier went through.
While Earl was busy preparing for war, Edith was at home with 2 children fighting a war of loneliness and fear.
During that very first part, I did not work. I stayed with the children, and then I lived with my mother. And if it had not been for her, I don't know whether I would have survived or not.
Meanwhile, back on the front lines, Hitler's fortress Europe was crumbling as the Allied assault stormed the shores of Normandy on June 6, 1944.
I didn't go in on D-Day, but we were part of the invasion fleet. And we went into battle in Normandy at Sugar Red, Utah Beach. They had Omaha and Sugar Red, Utah Beach, and I went on Utah. Some of the other Americans went in on Omaha. Of course, they had about five or six beaches, but there was 2 of them that was American beaches. They had 3 infantry outfits in Northern Ireland, the 2nd, 8th, and 5th, and I was in the 5th. And we had to come down the rope ladders and all into the LCIs, landing craft infantry, because they couldn't get all the way in.
The Allied forces began to liberate France and Belgium, and Earl remembers these days vividly. And even with death and chaos all around him, he never stopped thinking about family and friends back home, and he would even write letters home when he could.
One time, I hadn't got a letter from him in so long that I was so worried I didn't know what to do, and I went to the Red Cross.
Times that I couldn't write. In fact, I think they had maybe checked with the Red Cross or somebody one time, won't know why I hadn't written home, but you know, there's times you can't write. But I wrote home when I could write.
During wartime, there's no such thing as priority mail or next day delivery.
A lot of my mail might have got misplaced too that I wrote, I don't know. I know that one that Edith sent to me, that thing, it took about 6 months to reach me. That thing had been everywhere. It had been, I think, to Japan and Australia, you know. But they finally sent it to me.
September 8, 1944 was a day that would forever be etched into the minds of the Reagan family.
During the night, I had this real dream. Well, it was just, you know, more like I guess you'd call a nightmare. But I was dreaming that Earl was wounded, Earl was hurt, and I was trying to get to him.
Little did Edith know that at that very moment, Earl was facing dangerous ground as Patton's Third Army and the Allied forces were encountering pockets of resistance as they continued the liberation of France and Belgium.
I'd got wounded at Metz, France, with the infantry. And after crossing the Moselle River and the fortress city of Metz, and they had a lot of, well, that's where a lot of the Germans took their training. You had a lot of SS troops there and all. They could drop a mortar shell in your hip pocket. They knew all of the, you know, the terrain and everything else. And
I could see like a dark field, you know, just, and I guess it was a war field. I was seeing where they were all wounded and all. And so I was crying in my sleep, and Mama, she said, it woke her up, and she said, Edith, is there something wrong? And I told her I said, I think there might be something wrong with Earl.
We were in a patch of woods, and they started throwing some artillery shells in there. Of course, the small arm farms were going too. But they had they would put fuses on them when they'd go off at a certain height, and they call them a tree burst. And they put some of those tree bursts in there, and they'd be right kind of at the top of the trees, and they would explode, and pieces of shrapnel would come down. There was 2 or 3 of us got hit at one time, I know.
I knew that something was wrong, see, I knew that.
I got hit in the back. That's where most of the damage was done. But I still have a little piece of shrapnel in the leg. They didn't take it out. He showed me on the x-ray. It's kind of like between the bone or something. And he said gristle would go around that, and it would cost, you know, probably harder to take it out and want to leave it. and it hasn't caused me any problem that I know of.
I wrote him the next morning, and I told him about that dream. And that was when he was wounded.
So it was, you got the letter.
So I didn't get the telegram until a month later. I was relieved when I got the telegram because, see, my cousin, the same age of me, and we'd all gone to school together, and her husband was killed the same day that Earl was wounded.
After his release from the Army hospital, he was commissioned into the 217th Anti-Aircraft Artillery Gun Battalion. He then went on to fight in the largest, most confusing and stunning battle fought on the Western Front in World War II, the Battle of the Bulge.
Every town that we took, it's called liberating the towns, you know, and all. So that started from the time from Normandy all until the war was over.
After the Battle of the Bulge had been concluded in January of 1945, the German forces were never a serious threat again on the Western Front, and its strength in the east was soon to dissolve as well. There was still some fight left in these Germans, but with the monumental forces against them, defeat was inevitable. As the Allied forces drove deep into Germany, they came on the first concentration camps and revealed the full evil of Hitler's Third Reich. The German concentration camps had a single purpose: to facilitate mass murder. They were staffed with SS thugs who used a variety of means to accomplish their ends: machine guns, gas chambers, starvation, poison, brutality, disease, medical experiments, and overwork.
He sent me one picture of the Holocaust with all the Jews, you know, that had been, and he said, you know, this is real. And this is why, you know, he felt like it was fighting.
When the war was over, I wound up in a little place in Germany called Erwin, E-R-I-N, I believe was the way you spell it, or E-R-W-I-N. And it was right across a river, the Enns River, from a little town known as Braunau, Austria. And that's where Hitler was born. That's his birthplace.
Armed resistance continued in Germany several days after the fall of Berlin, but it was hopeless and disorganized, and on May 7th, the remnants of the Third Reich surrendered unconditionally. The reaction to this news was total elation from the Allies.
It was something that I imagine all the soldiers thought about. Hey, listen, I can't believe this. I'm still alive. You know, I'm still alive, and I'm going to get to go home to my family and my loved ones. And it was, and when I had seen so many, really, Tommy, of my buddies die or wounded and maimed and had to be sent home and all, was a good feeling, really, to know that you were still living.
Meanwhile, war in Japan still raged on, but on August 6, 1945 at 9:15 a.m., more than half the city of Hiroshima, Japan was obliterated. 60% of it was absolutely erased by an atomic bomb. Then 3 days later, Nagasaki became the target of the second atomic bomb. Again, the effects were awesome and fearful. 6 days later, the Allied forces were given the unconditional surrender of all Japanese forces.
I can talk to you about it, and you can see things on the movie and all like that, but there's no way under God's blue heaven that anyone can express to someone else the feeling that he has during combat. You know, it's just hell on earth if you're a frontline soldier.
After 5 major campaigns, Earl was finally returning home with a Purple Heart, a Combat Infantryman's Badge, an Expert Infantryman's Badge, and a campaign medal with 5 Bronze Service Stars.
When I first came back, we landed in Boston. Well, Fort Miles Standish is a camp there in Boston, Fort. Then I went from there to Fort Bragg. I was discharged from Fort Bragg and came on home. Well, it's something that I'd been looking for. I was overseas 2 years, and it's something I'd been looking for all that time, hoping and praying, you know, that I would get back home. So it's a feeling that, you know, that just lifts you up. It's one of the greatest feelings that I've ever had.
We really weren't expecting him because we did not have a telephone and didn't have a car. And so whenever he came in the night to the bus station and took a cab and came home. It was like, I don't know, maybe 1 or 2 o'clock in the morning. And we were, of course, all in the bed. We heard him. As soon as we heard his feet hit the porch, though, everybody jumped up.
Joyce, like I say, I saw her one day, and 2 years later I saw her again. And all those 2 years, off and on, I'd been taking her picture out of my pocket, looking at it, and dreaming about seeing her again. But now it was a reality. Well, I wasn't looking at the picture anymore. I was looking at the little girl.
She sat up in that bed, and her big old eyes were just rolling. We said, "Do you know who this is?" And she said, "That's my daddy. That's my daddy." And he carried her all the way from there over to his mom's in Parkdale. That's a long way, I guess, about 2 miles or so. But we all got up, put on our clothes, and walked over to Parkdale so his mom and dad could see him. It was a great, great night. And the moon was at its brightest.